Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm catching up again with my current read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along of Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House, where over 18 months we read Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House in the original serialised parts that it was originally published in. So that's about 3 chapters a month for many, many months. I'm a little bit behind, but this video is on February's chapters, so catching up a little bit. In February we read 3 chapters. We read chapter 36, Chesney, Wold, chapter 37, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and chapter 38, A Struggle. So, as usual, I'm going to go through those chapters, talking about what happens in them and any points of interest. These 3 chapters are all in Esther's first-person narrative, and yeah, lots is going on. So, chapter 36, Chesney, Wold. Esther, recovering from her illness, goes down to Mr. Boythorn's house, which is near Chesney, Wold. Mr. Boythorn isn't there, but she goes there with Charlie, and later Ada is going to come and join her. The house has been set up perfectly for her, and all the servants are very, very caring of her. Mr. Boythorn cares about her a lot and has left everything in good order in order to make sure she is as comfortable as possible, and her and Charlie pass a pleasant few days there recovering. Esther finally looks at herself in the mirror and sees the extent of the changes to her face that her illness has wrought. And then a few days after that, while walking in the woods near Chesney, Wold, Esther is approached by Lady Dedlock. We know by this point in the book that Lady Dedlock is Esther's mother, but Esther does not find it out until this moment when Lady Dedlock approaches her, comes up to her and tells her so. Tells her that she never knew that her child had lived, tells her that now that she knows her child lives, she has been so terrified that Esther was going to die before she could see her again when Esther was ill, and also that though her child is alive and though that she loves Esther and wishes to talk to Esther and wishes to spend time with her, she can't, and she intends never to see Esther again because she owes it to her husband and his reputation and her own reputation to not let anyone know that she has an illegitimate child. So they find each other finally and part. This leaves Esther in great dismay, feeling that she should never have been born, feeling that she is a blight on Lady Dedlock's reputation, feeling that she is the steps on the ghost walks, she is the one that will bring ruin to the Dedlock house, and she is only cheered when Ada comes to Chesney, Wold, and this lightens her load. So let's talk about points of interest in this chapter. First, I want to talk about Esther's appearance and Esther's view of her own appearance. I spoke a little bit about this in the last video, about the significance of Esther's facial disfigurement after having smallpox and the way she approaches it, which I think is quite interesting. And I want to read this passage, the moment where she looks at herself in the mirror and we see the effect that it has on her opinion of herself, how changed she is. I was very much changed, oh very, very much. At first my face was so strange to me that I think I should have put my hands before it and started back but for the encouragement I have mentioned. Very soon it became more familiar, and then I knew the extent of the alteration in it better than I had done at first. It was not like what I had expected, but I had expected nothing definite, and I dare say anything definite would have surprised me. I had never been a beauty, and had never thought myself one, but I had been very different from this. It was all gone now. Heaven was so good to me that I could let it go with a few not bitter tears, and could stand there arranging my hair for the night quite thankfully. Esther is determined not to let this change her life and not to let this interfere with her happiness, but she does say that she worries that she no longer has any right to keep Mr. Woodcourt's flowers, believing that he thought her beautiful and that he would no longer do so, therefore does she have any right to keep them, but she decides that it is okay and that she can keep his flowers that she pressed for sentimental reasons. And interesting too to note as well that Esther is much more honest with herself and with the readers about her feelings for Mr. Woodcourt now that she believes nothing can ever come of them. I also think it's worth dwelling on how much care is taken of Esther in these chapters, because it shows you quite how much the people around Esther love her and care about her, and quite how glad everyone is that she is okay and that she did not die from her illness. She says, "If a good fairy had built the house for me with a wave of her wand, and I had been a princess and her favoured godchild, I could not have been more considerate in it." Mr. Boythorn leaves everything in order, and he also leaves his bird there for her to take care of, which she knows is a real symbol of trust, which is really lovely. But of course, let's talk about the scene between Lady Dedlock and Esther, because that is at the heart of this chapter and one of the sort of key moments in this book. Although interestingly, a lot of the dialogue in it is reported rather than direct dialogue, and we just get a sense of what they're saying rather than a lot of the actual words. "I was fluttered by her being unexpectedly so near, and would have risen to continue my walk. But I could not. I was rendered motionless, not so much by her hurried gesture of entreaty, not so much by her quick advance and outstretched hand, not so much by the great change in her manner and the absence of her haughty self-restraint, as by a something in her face that I had pined for and dreamed of when I was a little child, something I had never seen in any face, something I had never seen in hers before. This moment is a moment where Esther sees Lady Dedlock looking at her with maternal affection and maternal love, which is something no one has ever shown her before, and that's really powerful. And then she sends Charlie off, and then I cannot tell in any words what the state of my mind was when I saw in her hands my handkerchief with which I had covered the dead baby. It's a really emotional moment between them. We see the despair that Lady Dedlock is in, and also the complete, how thoroughly overwhelmed Esther is by this truth and the suddenness of it, and also the suddenness of the then parting that must follow. My unhappy mother told me that in my illness she had been nearly frantic. She had but then known that her child was living. She could not have suspected me to be that child before. She had followed me down here to speak to me but once in all her life. We never could associate, never could communicate, never probably from that time forth could interchange another word on earth. She had put into my hands a letter she had written for my reading only, and said when I had read it and destroyed it, but not so much for her sake, since she asked nothing, as for her dear husband's and my own, I must evermore consider her as dead. If I could believe that she loved me in this agony in which I saw her with a mother's love, she asked me to do that, for then I might think of her with a greater pity, imagining what she suffered. She had put herself beyond all hope and beyond all help. Whether she preserved her secret until death, or it came to be discovered and she brought dishonour and disgrace upon the name she had taken, it was her solitary struggle always, and no affection could come near her, and no human creature could render her any aid. And it is here that Lady Dedlock tells Esther that she is terrified of Mr. Tulkinghorn, and terrified that Mr. Tulkinghorn may discover her secret and may discover her past. And this is one of the few moments in this book when we see Lady Dedlock's weakness, because usually she is so cold and she is so impassive, and in this moment she admits that she is afraid of this man that usually she cannot bear to admit that she is afraid of, but she admits it to Esther because suddenly with Esther, with her child, she becomes who she actually is, when usually she is pretending to be someone else. She says, if you hear of Lady Dedlock, brilliant, prosperous and flattered, think of your wretched mother, conscience-stricken underneath that mask. Think that the reality is in her suffering, in her useless remorse, in her murdering within her breast the only love and truth of which it is capable. And then forgive her if you can, and cry to heaven to forgive her, which it never can. And more intense still is Esther's reaction to it. Esther admits that that night she felt as if I knew it would have been better and happier for many people if indeed I had never breathed, that I had a terror of myself as the danger and the possible disgrace of my own mother and of a proud family name, that I was so confused and shaken as to be possessed by belief that it was right and had been intended that I should die in my birth, and that it was wrong and not intended that I should be alive. Esther in this moment truly believes that because of the disgrace that she may bring on the Dedlock family, maybe it would have been better if she had never breathed. However, she is alive, and the next morning, especially when she knows that Ada is coming, she begins to think to herself, well, I am alive, and that means I'm supposed to be alive, and it's okay, and I'll be all right, and I can continue. And she remembers all the happy things in her life, brought to the fore of her mind even more when Ada appears. And she is worried that Ada will be scared and afraid or horrified or upset by Esther's scarring and the change in her appearance. But instead, ah, my angel girl. The dear old look, all love, all fondness, all affection, and nothing else in it. Which is a nice moment of the true friendship between them. So, I think that's all I wanted to say on that chapter. Now on to chapter 37, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. While staying at Mr. Boythorn's house, Esther is suddenly told that there is a gentleman to see her at the inn. She doesn't know who it is, but when she gets there she finds Richard there with Skimpole, and Richard has come down to see Ada and wants Esther to take him over to where they are. He says he is currently on leave for the army and is going to spend some time with Ada and Esther down here if he can, and then is going to go back down to London to look after his interests. He also wants to check that this is okay because Mr. Jarndyce doesn't like him, and of course he has come purposefully to somewhere where Mr. Jarndyce is not. Richard goes back with Esther to the house to see Ada, spends a little time with them, including discussing with Esther the court case and how hopeful he is for the future, though very much in debt and very much struggling, and how much Esther worries for his future. His lawyer then turns up and brings him back down to London. And although the engagement between Ada and Richard is at an end, Ada says to Esther that she knows she will love Richard for as long as they live, and that she knows that the more Richard needs something stable and something kind in his life, the more she wants to be that stability and that kindness. So, points of interest in this chapter, there are a lot, especially to do with the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce and the relationship between Richard and Esther. I've always really enjoyed Richard and Esther's friendship, especially because it's not that common in Victorian literature to find a platonic friendship between a man and a woman, and it is a really nice one between them. The moment Richard sees Esther, he says, "My dear Esther, my best friend." And there's a really important moment here where after Esther tells him how Ada is, Richard says, "Answering my very thoughts, always the same dear girl." And then she lifts her veil and he says again, "Always the same dear girl," just to make sure that she knows that he doesn't care what she looks like and that it makes no difference, and that they will always be really, really close friends. Because he knows that that is the kind of thing that Esther would worry about. And I like that moment between them. Although, of course, they soon come to a little bit of tension and conflict over Richard's prospects. When Esther asks how Richard likes the army, he says, "Oh, I like it well enough. It's all right. It does as well as anything for a time." And what he, of course, really cares about is Chancery and trying to solve his case, which Esther can't know is never going to be solved, and Richard really thinks is. He's also keeping very bad company, hanging out with Skimpole, who is really not someone you should hang out with, especially if you're trying to avoid getting into debt. When discussing the case with Esther, Richard again says that he doesn't really trust Mr. Jarndyce because Mr. Jarndyce's interests are conflicting with his. "If I have had the misfortune to be under that influence, so has he. If it has a little twisted me, it may have a little twisted him too. I don't say that he is not an honourable man, out of all this complication and uncertainty. I'm sure he is. But it taints everybody. You know it taints everybody. You have heard him say so 50 times. Then why should he escape?" And when Esther says she doubts that anything good may come out of the case, Richard says, "There is truth and justice somewhere in the case, Esther, or was once long ago," said I. Must be somewhere," pursued Richard, "and must be brought out. John Jarndyce says it changes, has changed, and will change everybody who has a share in it. Then the greater right I have on my side when I resolve to do all I can to bring it to an end. It can't last forever. Others have only half thrown themselves into it. I devote myself to it. I make it the object of my life." He has become slowly more and more obsessed with Jarndyce and Jarndyce until that does consume his life, to the extent that Esther believes it has very much affected his relationship with Ada. It was not difficult to read her blushing scarlet face. She loved him dearly, and he knew it, and I knew it. It was a very transparent business, that meeting as cousins only. I almost mistrusted myself, as growing quite wicked in my suspicions, but I was not so sure that Richard loved her dearly. He admired her very much, anyone might have done that, and I dare say would have renewed their youthful engagement with great pride and ardour, but that he knew how she would respect her promise to my guardian. Still, I had a tormenting idea that the influence upon him extended even here, that he was postponing his best truth and earnestness in this as in all things until Jarndyce and Jarndyce should be off his mind. Ah me, what Richard would now have been without that blight I shall never know. In other words, Richard may still love Ada, Richard may still want to marry Ada, but he is more bothered about Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and he cannot really focus on anything and truly care about anything except the case until the case is settled. Another thing that I think is interesting in terms of looking at the relationship between Ada and Richard is the letter that Ada writes him. Ada is quite an interesting character because she is one that is present a lot in Bleak House, but actually you don't necessarily get to know that well, and I don't think she is as fully formed a character as Esther. And at some points I think she is a fairly passive character, but there are moments like this when the letter that she writes to Richard here, where she is quite strong. "I have some fears, my dearest cousin, that it may be partly for my sake you are now laying up so much unhappiness for yourself, and if for yourself, for me. In case that should be so, and in case you should entertain much thought of me in what you are doing, I most earnestly entreat and beg you to desist. You can do nothing for my sake that will make me half so happy as for ever turning your back upon that shadow in which we both were born. Do not be angry with me for saying this. Pray, pray, dear Richard, for my sake and for your own, and in a natural repugnance for that source of trouble which had its share in making us both orphans when we were very young, pray, pray, let it go forever. We have reason to know by this time that there is no good in it and no hope, that there is nothing to be got from it but sorrow." And she is strong at that moment, and she has made up her mind firmly that the case is bad and that she wishes Richard and herself and everyone were well out of it. I want to talk very briefly about Mr. Vholes. Mr. Skimpole admits quite casually that he was bribed to introduce Richard to Mr. Vholes and that he went along and did it because he doesn't care. And we get the impression that Mr. Vholes is not a very nice man, that he is mostly in it for the money, even though he has a kind of legitimate reasons to be in it for the money, as it were, and he talks about his 3 daughters and his aging father who he has to support. And in many ways, although Vholes is a kind of unpleasant seeming man and seems to not care very much about Richard and to care mostly about getting money out of Richard, at the same time I think you can see him in a similar light to Mr. Neckett, Charlie's father, who may have been doing a fairly unpleasant job but also did have a family to support and did support that family. Mr. Vholes, however, is not the character that Esther very much warms to, or that we as readers very much warm to either. And I think that's all I have to say on that chapter, so let's move on to the next one, chapter 38, A Struggle. In this chapter, Esther and Ada return to Bleak House, and shortly after having returned to Bleak House, Esther goes into London in order to see Caddy and also to see Mr. Guppy. And the reason why she wants to see Mr. Guppy is because she knows or suspects that Mr. Guppy has been making inquiries into her past, and that now, knowing who her mother is and knowing it's in her mother's interest very much for the secret of Esther's birth not to get out, she goes to Mr. Guppy to tell him that she doesn't want him to make any inquiries into her birth and to make sure that he isn't going to. Mr. Guppy, seeing that Esther is now very physically scarred from smallpox, immediately assumes that she now wants to marry him and has decided that he definitely doesn't want to marry her, and is very awkward and embarrassed of it, slightly ashamed about the fact that his love was so superficial and shallow, that he only loved her for her face and now her face is different, he doesn't love her anymore, but also at the same time is very much keen for her to admit that she rejected him and that that was quite final. So, points of interest in this chapter. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about Caddy and her married life. Caddy is quite an interesting character and her plotline is quite interesting, and it's interesting to note that although much of what is criticised in Caddy's mother, Mrs. Jellyby, is her desire to work and how that seems kind of unfeminine and also neglectful of her family, and how that makes her, within Victorian society's eyes, in some ways unfeminine, but also how it means that she does neglect her family. But it's interesting to note that Caddy, although she seems very much to have a stronger sense of duty towards the people around her and towards her family, Caddy also works incredibly hard and has a lot of jobs to do. She is qualifying herself to give lessons in dancing, she's also learning 2 instruments, and she's determined to work very hard to help make the dancing school a success and to help her husband make it a success, and also to support her slightly weird father-in-law. I also really like the fact in this chapter that we learn that Caddy's father comes really regularly, like every evening, and just like sits in the corner to have a bit of peace from home. It's quite sweet, really, and it's such an odd image to imagine Mr. Turveydrop and Mr. Jellyby just like chatting about the Prince Regent. But of course the main thing to talk about in this chapter is Esther's encounter with Guppy, which is one of the most painful things to read in Dickens, because it is excruciatingly embarrassing in many ways and also just makes Guppy like drop in the estimation of everybody reading the book. Miss Summerson, said Mr. Guppy, rising, "this is indeed an oasis." And then Esther uncovers her face. "I could hardly have believed that anybody could in a moment have turned so red or changed so much as Mr. Guppy did as I now put up my veil. I caused him embarrassment enough as it was, I'm sure. I never saw such faltering, such confusion, such amazement and apprehension. Miss Summerson," stammered Mr. Guppy, I beg your pardon, but in our profession, we find it necessary to be explicit. And later, my intention was to remark that you was so good on that occasion as to repel and repudiate that declaration. You wouldn't perhaps object to admit it?" Basically, the implication is that Mr. Guppy thinks she's come there to kind of force him to marry her, which he doesn't want to do, which she also really doesn't want to do. And he's both very embarrassed by her facial disfigurement and embarrassed by the fact that she is no longer beautiful to him, and also a bit ashamed of the fact that his love was so shallow. I must do Mr. Guppy the further justice of saying that he had looked more and more ashamed. He swears very strongly and very earnestly that he will not look into Esther's past anymore and that he will fully leave that alone. But also is at great pains to stress that she rejected him and that he could not possibly renew his proposals now. He even goes so far as to run after her in the street in order to swear that in front of Caddy, which is all very awkward and kind of unpleasant, and as I said, lets Guppy just slowly drop in the reader's estimation. I spoke a bit last time about how Esther's changed appearance in the centre of this book is really interesting to look at, especially in the way that other characters react to it. For example, we see the way Mr. Jarndyce and Ada and Rick really couldn't care less except that they're sad for her in case she's sad about it, whereas for Mr. Guppy, the only thing that he admired or cared about in Esther was her appearance. He barely knew her, and we now know that however melodramatic his passion and love may have seemed, it was very shallow and very surface deep. And also you can imagine that this encounter would rather give fuel to Esther's belief that Mr. Woodcourt could no longer possibly care for her. So I think that's all I wanted to say on those 3 chapters. Please let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed those chapters and your thoughts on them. In the month of March, which is currently underway, we have 4 chapters to read. Chapter 39, Attorney and Client, Chapter 40, National and Domestic, Chapter 41, In Mr. Tulkinghorn's Room, and Chapter 42, In Mr. Tulkinghorn's Chambers. So, that is all I want to say for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.